Welcome to the Star Chamber. I'm Ryan Swayze, a retired Air Force Lieutenant Colonel and the founder and president of the Walk the Talk Foundation, a nonprofit that advocates for and advises currently serving and former military service members going through the arduous journey of administrative processes and investigations in our government.
And I am Francesca Graham, a retired Army Lieutenant Colonel and the Chief Operating Officer and Chief Advisor for the Walk the Talk Foundation. For all our returning guests, welcome back. And for our new listeners, thank you for tuning in. Before we begin this week's topic, please do not forget to hit that subscribe button, check out our Walk the Talk Foundation website, and hit that donate button if you think we're doing a good job. Also, check out our newsletter, the DoD Times Redacted, on all the socials, including LinkedIn, X, Instagram, and Facebook. Links in the description. All right, Star Chamber listeners, let's get started. Welcome back, everyone, to the Star Chamber, the podcast where we talk about the administrative injustices within the Department of Defense and the Coast Guard. Today we have with us an amazing guest. He is a retired Lieutenant Colonel retired Jeff Gorez. While he was in the Army, he was a Huey and Black Hawk pilot with over 1,000 hours combined in those two airframes. He was, for at least a decade, the only officer that was also a maintenance test pilot. He commissioned in 1991 for the University of Arizona ROTC program. He is a proud father of 4 children. He has been happily married for 23 years, and he is currently serving on the school board as a school board trustee of the Coppers Cove School District in Texas. So, why do we have Jeff on our show, aside from him being a pretty amazing guy, is because follow-up from our last episode where we talked about my experience as an untrained, multi-hatted person who was sent down to Fort Hood at the time, now Fort Cavazos in Texas, to be part of the investigatory team with General Kurilla of the 1st Cav Division. Now, for those of you who don't know, a division is roughly 20,000 people-ish. And we were, myself, General Kurilla, a small group of about 20 different officers and enlisted were sent in 2021, correct? I think that's right. Yeah, 2021, to investigate 1st Cav Division for issues related to sexual harassment and sexual assault, and generally the command climate of the division. And that investigation occurred as one of the many investigations that occurred following the brutal murder of Specialist Vanessa Guillen. And then the murder itself, of course, but from an organizational perspective, the many issues that were identified with the leadership and their decisions at Fort Cavazos, and specifically with the 3rd Corps and those subordinate divisions. Now, when I say Corps, what I mean is that an organization that is approximately 70,000 people, and you have multiple divisions inside the Corps. And we were tasked to investigate one of those divisions, 1st Cav Division. At the time when we were sent to do that investigation, Jeff was the SHARP program manager for 3 Corps. So when I say SHARP, what I mean is the sexual harassment, assault prevention response program, which is the Army's answer to how do we deal with this thing called sexual harassment and sexual assault in the Army. And it's a program, they've got pamphlets, they have briefings, they have people that are assigned to help people out and who are experiencing these issues or have witnessed them, etc. So he was the SHARP program manager for 3 Corps, and 1st Cav Division was one of the divisions inside of 3 Corps. He was also, at that time, a victim advocate. So during our investigation, I actually ran into Jeff a couple times, which was kind of interesting. But before we get started, and before we begin our conversation with Jeff, I'd like to read the quick disclaimer that we read every single time on these programs. The opinions and views expressed by guests on this podcast are solely their own and do not represent the officials' policies, positions, or endorsements of the U.S. Army, the Department of Defense, or any other government entity. This discussion is intended for informational purposes only and should not be construed as reflecting the official stance of any military or governmental organization. Suck it, Poindexters. I didn't even have to prompt Ryan on that one.
In unison.
In unison. Yeah, exactly. So, Jeff, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. We've been eager to have you on the show. And kind of my first question to you, aside from, welcoming you to the show, is what was the climate, the leadership climate specifically, on Fort Cavazos at the time, Fort Hood, at the time that 18th Airborne Corps, my corps that I was a part of with General Kurilla, was sent down to Fort Cavazos from Fort Bragg to investigate the 1st Cav Division?
Well, first, thank you very much for having me. It's an honor to be part of this team and to support your efforts into getting after injustice. And I think the best way to describe it is you have to understand some of the background prior to you all getting there. That year, yours was a fifth official investigation going on.
Wow.
And it was, and I'm, obviously retired officer. The best way to describe the atmosphere was intimidation and fear, right? Intimidation and fear. And that is the senior officers, the senior staff, the senior officers were extremely concerned, right? Extremely concerned with the events and what was being, relayed and being discovered, that every time they would pronounce that something was in compliance, it'd come out that it wasn't, right? Or they should have been aware and they weren't, and they were being proven wrong across the board. When you all got there, it was, I think, a week or two right prior to the FERIC report coming out.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember a very, very frank discussion with that committee, the lead of that committee, prior to their report coming out, and it was going to be troublesome, right? It was going to be traumatic. So to continue, there was anxiety. I mean, and let's put it mildly. There was a tremendous amount of anxiety.
And so, Jeff, when you say, and sorry to interrupt you, when you say anxiety or concern from the leadership, is that a concern for their people or a concern for themselves that they're going to be exposed for not having done the correct things or not conducting correct oversight or whatnot?
It was completely about being held accountable.
Okay.
All right, completely about being held accountable. Unfortunately, especially when General Kurilla's team came on board, it was already discovered the lack of compliance was quite evident across the board, right? And it was no longer a hidden feature, right, or a hidden secret with anybody. And one of the things that was really disturbing to me was every time, whether DA Sharp or Force Com Sharp or another command would come up to a conclusion, I would be asked for, to refute or to support that conclusion. And oftentimes, specifically with DA Sharp, their conclusion was just 180 degrees off. They themselves, were supposed to be the experts in the policy. And most oftentimes the IOs were getting policy guidance from DA Sharp, which is completely incorrect. Right?
And when you're saying DA Sharp, you're saying Department of the Army Sharp and
Department of the Army Sharp.
Yeah, right? And then IOs are investigating officers.
The investigating officers.
And when you say that their guidance or their feedback was completely off, what do you mean by that specifically? And who was asking you to refute or to agree with the findings?
Well, I'll give you an example. I mean, one of the things that was a challenge for compliance, specifically with John Kurilla's investigation, was 1st Cav. And 1st Cav is, they during that time period, they didn't participate in the Sexual Assault Review Board. right?
Yeah, I remember
Command
that.
didn't participate in it. The brigade commanders didn't participate in it. Just representatives, all right? And usually those representatives were junior field grade officers, right? Brigade XOs, brigade S3s, and other brigade executive officers, again, a junior field grade officer, etc. And that's not the way the regulation is written. It's command and command led across the board. And one of the things that I had to address with specifically General Corrella's investigation was Department of the Army Sharp said, well, that is amicable, right? You can do this, but there's no exception to policy out there, right? Nobody could provide it. And the regulation at the time was quite direct on who had to attend.
So at the highest levels, Department of the Army Sharp program was trying to make excuses for what was happening within 3 Corps and 1st Cav Division specifically.
Oh, absolutely. And unfortunately, the Department of the Army Sharp, early on in this tragedy during the initial investigations, became very non-participatory, right? They allowed me to have access to certain, the databases, right? Defense Sexual Assault Incident Database, the Incident Case Support System for Sexual Harassment. So I could do all the data mining. They were not going to be that, team player supporting those efforts. Specifically in the Fort Hood Independent Review Committee reports, much of that data is quantified and results from my analysis across the board.
So so now General Kurilla, myself, the rest of the team, we're now down at Fort Cavazos and we are starting our investigation. We're having 20,000 people take a survey, all these things, which is very disruptive. And oh, by the way, let's not forget it's early 2021, so COVID is still underway. So what were your general observations as the Sharp program manager for the Corps, as having gone through 3 prior investigations up to that point? What were your general observations on the conduct of the investigation that we did?
Well, the conduct of the investigation, what was surprising to me was really the lack of understanding and awareness of where specifically the 3 Corps Sharp staff was at. And there was a sense of that was the priority, right? The investigation was the priority. The investigating officer, right? That was their mission. That was their priority, and came in. And again, my impression, kind of heavy-handed, right? Heavy-handed. And one specific example is, prior to the team getting on board, and for everybody that's out there, as again, I'm a retired officer. Any investigation, it's the responsibility of the investigating officer to make sure that they have the appointment orders with them for the scope of the investigation. And before the team even got there, I can't remember the action officer, senior IO, but they had sent up the whole schedule and everything else. And I put out a response that I normally did. Again, this is the 3rd major investigation, 4th one to include the Force Com IG. I just want your appointment orders so I can send them out to the team to let them know that this is the investigation. And oh, by the way, that if we're going to be subject to the investigation, we have certain rights, right? We have certain rights. And it was very interesting that that was a contentious issue.
I mean, correct me if I'm wrong here, Jeff, but the environment very much seemed or sounds like it was very confrontational, very adversarial, as in it was us versus them, them versus us. Yes?
I would say at a minimum it was adversarial. I wouldn't say it's so much confrontational, but it was definitely adversarial. Which was quite interesting considering that the office up until this time, and I say the office, the program management office, had been through multiple site assistance visits over the years, and everything was within norms, right? Everything was within, even the FORSCOM IG, the Fort Hood Independent Review Committee, General Murray's AFC investigation. There was very little to condemn the program management or the office actions across the board. But General Carilla's investigation, it seemed like, became very adversarial. Again, the IO orders, the investigating officer orders, was just an indication of that. The other aspect of it, too, is that investigation seemed to be a lot of he said, she said type things. I was interviewed, my team was interviewed multiple times. What seemed like every time they would go back and check with somebody, they'd have a follow-up. And that's part of the process, right? I got it, part of the process. But it seemed to be, again, to the point of an adversarial, right? In my opinion, there was a predisposition that was on the agenda.
So
What was that agenda?
Well, I think it was to straight up to clear the senior command of the 1st Cavalry Division, right? And not to lay blame of the senior commanders at the 1st Cavalry Division, as well as the 3 Corps headquarters.
And that's what I was just going to ask is, did you get the sense that the effort, from your perspective, did you get the sense that the effort was to deflect from the commanders, the sitting commanders, the actual issues, their responsibilities, and instead blame this PowerPoint presentation and a bunch of paper documents that's called the SHARP program?
Oh, wholeheartedly, right? Wholeheartedly. And which is interesting because 600-20 is a commander's program, right? It is a commander's program. There is no leeway around that. It is the commander and sometimes the deputy senior commander. But at that time, 600-20, it was the installation senior commander as well as the commander of the organization. Mm-hmm. Now that organization, at that time in the Army, every brigade element on the way up, in other words, brigade, divisions, corps, right? Colonel commands and above all had a full-time SHARP team that was supposed to be assigned to them. Mm-hmm. And those commanders, that program belonged to those commanders.
Which is why it's relevant. A little bit earlier, you had mentioned that the commanders were not attending the sexual assault response boards. I think that's what they're called, the SARBs.
The SARBs, right.
Yeah,
they were. Nowadays, they've changed it to the case management group with the latest update. But at that time, it was sexual assault review boards.
Board, yeah. And so when you say, well, the commanders weren't showing up, for all the Poindexters out there, say like, oh, well, he just doesn't understand what it's like to be in command of it. Well, the fact of the matter is, if you're trying to blame the program for failing and trying to deflect the blame for a failing climate, you're trying to deflect that onto the SHARP program instead of the commanders. It's relevant when the commanders aren't actually supporting the program the way they're supposed to. So that's why that specific piece is relevant. So, and Jeff, what you were saying really kind of helps explain some of the sense that I was getting and that I mentioned on our previous episode, which is that there really seemed to be a strong desire from some of the people on the investigatory team to protect the officers, officer protectionism. And I rebelled against that quite vigorously. So what were you then being told as the SHARP program manager for 3 Corps, as a victim advocate? What were you being told by the leadership to how to respond to our questions or what to query, whether 3 Corps, Department of the Army, whoever?
Well, at this time, fortunately, again, this is January 2021. At this time, there was an acceptance of investigation is going to take its own turn, right? I didn't have to clear any of my answers with anybody. I didn't have to clear any of my submissions with the chief of staff or the deputy chief of staff, which was quite interesting, right? It was a quite different dynamic before. Now that may have been purposeful, or that or they just were exhausted from the previous investigations. What I was being told is in multiple instances was to comply, to participate, to ensure all the victim advocates, all the SARCS folks, everybody was available to participate, to include the team that I had. And, that was the other thing that was very, very difficult at the time was, we were half staffed at the team, and we're trying to run the program, right? We have responsibility, we have accountability of actually executing the program, but at the same time, we're taking care of victims, as well as answering multiple RFIs from the investigating officers. At this time, we're still responding to congressional inquiries, dozens of Freedom of Information Act requests across the board. So it was a very trying time. As far as guidance, it was just comply, right, and participate 100%, make the timelines, etc. The only thing that took precedence was actually responding to a victim. Everything else was a secondary concerning the investigation.
And so what were and this is a very broad question, relevant not just to Fort Cavazos, but your experience as a SHARP program manager, what were your general impressions at that time and now of whether the Army took the SHARP program seriously?
Well, the Army didn't take the SHARP program and still does not take the SHARP program seriously. You could look away the structure has morphed over time, but specifically at that time frame, just a lack of support that we were getting from Department of the Army SHARP was an indicator of the Army emphasis with the SHARP program. We had dozens of vacancies across the installation and across the Army for victim advocates and SARCs, dozens. And there was no emphasis. No commanders were held accountable, right? No commanders were held accountable. There's program dynamics of, such at that time period, expedited transfers. Expedited transfers were to be completed within, 3 days, right? 72 hours. That was actually the way the regulation read, 72 hours.
And that's for a victim of sexual assault.
That's for victims, right? Yep. That's for victims. And again, it goes towards how does the Army, did the Army take the program seriously? Well, if somebody busted that 72-hour requirement, nobody was held accountable, right? Nobody was. You might have to do an MFR, to respond to DA SHARP of why it took so long, but that was it. There was never any command held accountable. And I would, in my experience, the dichotomy, the duplicity of justice, right, of accountability, and whereas if somebody was, let's say, an E5 or a first lieutenant with a sexual harassment complaint, they would get hammered compared to the lieutenant colonel or command sergeant major that had found a sexual harassment complaint, multiple times. Principal example, at that time period, and it was on the data, the Icarus, sexual harassment complaints are all held in the incident case reporting system, Icarus. And one of the really disturbing findings during the investigations was the lack of compliance that the commands had in updating the data. In other words, the alleged offenders, how they were found, the findings of the report, what happened to the alleged offender, etc. And it really was up to the command to keep that up to date. And it was horrific to see that, if I remember the data, about 35% of the records were actually accurate. About 35% of the records were actually accurate. Everything else, specifically with alleged offender follow-ups and alleged offender accountability, hardly any of that was ever inputted, especially for a formal sexual harassment complaint. If there was a formal sexual harassment complaint, it would be rare that the alleged offender's name would actually be in the database.
So you have no way of tracking anything.
No. And at that time, we could not. We just didn't have the manpower to track sexual harassment. I mean, we were being overrun with sexual assaults, 360 a year on the installation, right? 360 victims a year on the installation. We just did not have the manpower.
Oh
but who did have it was DA Sharp. Department of the Army Sharp had plenty of data crunchies up there that could look at this. And they had the data because every year they send out reports to get it updated. But the commanders were never held accountable, right? Commanders were never held accountable.
So for the layman here who isn't familiar as much with the Sharp, but all the problems sound strikingly familiar to the IG system. So you have this program, the Sharp program. I know that's like ATM machine. Sorry. So you've got, this response and prevention program created to placate our Congress, right? That's its origin, I'm assuming, right?
It is. It absolutely is. 2012.
There's a lot of people getting assaulted and harassed. Okay, we need to do something. Slap a Band-Aid on it, call it Sharp. Now we're good. Where is the oversight of this, what sounds like an abysmally run and managed program, and why is there no recourse?
Well, there's no oversight.
Okay.
Brian, there is none. And I can confidently say that. Why? Because the director for Army Sharp is a GS-15 who is multiple levels removed from any type of executive leadership. Currently, Department of the Army Sharp resides, at that time it was in the G1, right? It was in the G1.
It's a personnel division.
G1 personnel, right? It was under, personnel, right? Lieutenant General Bretterl at the time, which is another interesting story. But they're under the G1. But they answered to another officer, right? Another 06, right? So the director never had direct contact with the senior officer in charge of the G1. Years prior, I believe it was 2016, Sharp actually reported directly to the Vice Chief Staff of the Army. Currently, DA Sharp resides within a G9, which is in the installations, right? Under installation command, right? Under the prevention directorate, under our Army resiliency, right? So it's, again, the director for Department of the Army Sharp is multiple levels removed from any type of executive leadership.
And what about the oversight from Congress?
And that, unfortunately, my personal impression is extremely lacking. Extremely lacking. Again, personal experience, I've reached out to the HASC and the SASC, obviously as a whistleblower several years ago, and I did receive some replies, but there was very little action, right? Very little action, very little care or concern, and we're talking, we're talking informing Congress of fraud, right? Deliberate fraud, falsification of documents within the Sharp community, lack of command compliance, placing victims at risk for lack of victim advocacy, as well as intimidation and retaliation. And unfortunately, very few responses from the HASC or the SASC.
Also very sounding familiar now. Yes.
And for those of you who don't know, the HASC is the House Armed Services Committee and the SASC is the Senate Armed Services Committee. So Jeff, so you have this program. It's got millions of dollars pumped into it with hiring of federal civilians, training of military personnel. And we're just saying Sharp for the Army. All of the services have their own type of program, whether it's called Sharp or not. So millions of dollars, federal civilians, military personnel trained down to brigade level. So brigade is about 4,000 to 5,000 people. And you also have this other dynamic where certainly within the Army, I don't know about the other services, you have all of the service members who are complaining their brains out about having to go to another Sharp briefing. And this is stupid. And this is stupid. And this is, if we didn't have to go to these Sharp briefings, then maybe we could actually get qualified on our weapon system type of thing, right? So it's just this burning dumpster pile of terribleness from all sides. So the question is, why? Why is it that the Army keeps saying we need to support the Sharp? The Sharp program is great. This is our answer to these problems. What is the why behind that? Because it just doesn't make sense to me.
Well, I think it's the one solution. Excuse me, not the one solution. There's not just one solution. I think it is the convenient response to an issue of really horrific criminal behavior that exists within the services that no one can seem to wrap themselves around to get after for accountability. And I think it's just organizational, right? It's organizational platitudes to look at whatever's easiest and less risky for the organizational leadership, right? And sharp is a pretty low risk environment for the commander, especially nowadays. It's full of GS employees, right? Full of GS employees, which the command can threaten, intimidate, ostracize, really kind of fire, etc., at will with little risk. Mm-hmm. Because unfortunately, GS employees have very little rights during the process. Soldiers have a lot of more rights than a GS employee does across the board. So that is, that's the response. It's unfortunately, I don't understand, and I have not been able to get anybody to answer this, is why are we not focusing on character development on first term soldiers and, courage and reporting and getting after it? For years, for over 4 years, we tracked on the installation that 54% of all our sexual assault victims were first unit assigned soldiers, but there was no intervention, right? No Army directed intervention. We had the data. We did it. We took it upon ourselves to track all that for multiple years, but yet then there's no intervention. There's no invested program to get after and to support first unit assigned soldiers.
And I think that almost gets to what my last question is for you, which is, because you're starting to touch on it, is what are the internal conflicts that you noticed as a victim advocate, as the SHARP program manager for 3 Corps, who worked, so you're these things, but you also worked for the same person, and your performance evaluation was done by the same person whose command you were assigned to ensure that those victims actually were taken care of? What are the internal conflicts there?
Where have we seen that?
Yeah, I will tell you that's spot on, right? That conflict, right? And it's a balancing act, and it shouldn't have been, right? Because unfortunately, at least with the Army places SHARP personnel at risk, right? Because you're working for the individual that's rating you directly across the board. And we've all been there. How many commanders like bad news? Very few, right? And they like it less when you tell them, "Hey, sir, you're messing up," right? These forms that you just signed, First Cav or whoever, the forms you just signed are all fraudulent, right? Because background checks aren't complete. You're appointing victim advocates that aren't qualified, right? They don't want to hear that. They don't want to be told that they're messing up. They don't want to be told that their personnel are frauds, right? Or outside the scope and boundary of their duties, unethical, lacking integrity, etc. It is a conflict of interest. I think the only way really to get after that is, develop certain personnel protections outside the scope of the command. And it's interesting. You talked about conflict of interest, and I'm just going to give kind of 2 points of personal experience. Later in 2021, I think it was Army Directive 2021-6 that directed sexual harassment investigations would be executed by a third-party investigator. I might have got the -6, I might have got the dash number right, but I do know it was an Army Directive 2021 in May of 2021 that came out. And what is interesting is that directive originated out of Fort Cavazos, and the only reason that thing got published was because I gave it to the Fort Hood Independent Review Committee investigators. I said, "Hey, this is what I recommend going forward on sexual harassment." Unfortunately, the command does not want to do this because it takes away power from the subject's commander.
Yep.
Right. So you have an independent investigator. You're being recommended to have an independent investigator outside the subject's command to ensure impartiality of the investigation. Why? Because my 5 years of experience prior to that showed blatant bias and prejudice of IOs against subjects, right? All right. So they would find increasingly or wholeheartedly more for the alleged offender than they would for the complainant. Specifically, the higher ranker you were, battalion commander, command sergeant major, you were probably going to get be found unfounded, right? Junior officer, junior enlisted, oh, you're going to be founded.
Well, and that just feeds more and more into the narrative of the false complaints, sexual harassment, sexual assault, false complaints.
Well, and there's no, and that's rare, right? That is one of the rarest. It's a huge myth, right? Because I will tell you, I've sat with enough victims. There's no such thing as a false complaint. Yeah, somebody that's shaken, that's going through, a mental, emotional trauma. It happened. The problem is there enough evidence by the IO? Is the investigating officer for sexual harassment? Are they competent enough? Do they care enough? Are they professional enough to exude any prejudices and biases? And that's why that directive came out, to ensure third-party investigators looked at all sexual harassment complaints.
And then, correct me if I'm wrong, Jeff, you, for various different things, you as a victim advocate, as the program manager, you experienced reprisal for doing your job.
Very much so. Yep.
And that's something that you talk about quite a bit on social media. That's one of the larger issues that people in your profession have, or in your position have, is that you're trying to take care of the victim, and doing so endangers your own livelihood.
It does. It does. To be honest with you, I was fortunate enough to, find Walk the Talk, you all, that, gave me some great guidance at the time. And I took that guidance to heart, and I'm okay, right? I'm okay. I'm currently advising 6 victim advocates across the DOD that are, in my consideration, being retaliated against, right?
Wow.
6.
Yeah. Wow. And does it all stem from that conflict of interest, that subordinate superior relationship?
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
Every one of them, right? Every one of them. As well, from the conflict of interest, because unfortunately the go-to tool to go after somebody is the anonymous IG report, right? The anonymous IG report. Very difficult for a GS employee to defend yourself against an anonymous IG complaint. Remember, it's an administrative investigation. You just need 51%, right? You don't need to have a preponderance. Yeah. And oh, by the way, we all know investigating officers, they can take evidence or they not, right? They can deny it. They can whitewash it, right? They don't have to do anything. They're working for the commander. They're working for the commander. But yeah, there's of the six current cases, four of them are very much retaliatory because of the conflict of interest in the chain of command.
Yep. No, we hear that story every day, multiple times a day, and it doesn't make it any better, and it doesn't make it any less disheartening or surprising. So, Jeff, we really appreciate you coming on the show. This has been very great, illuminating. Yes. To get the other side of the paratrooper nation showing up with the armor community and making everyone. When you said heavy-handed, it kind of made me chuckle a little bit, because we knew that for those of you who don't know, there's a cultural conflict between paratroopers and the armor community, and 1st Cav Division is armor, hence cavalry.
Yes.
So we knew that we were already on the bad end of perception. So Jeff, really appreciate again the chat. Is there anything you'd like to say as we close out?
No, I want to thank you all. I want to thank the foundation for everything that you're doing and leading the way for cultural change. And hopefully, someday Congress will change how the IG system works, right, and get after retaliation and whistleblower protections.
Amen.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you again, Jeff. And then Ryan, did you have any closing comments?
That's it. No, thank you, Jeff. Appreciate it. Great show.
All right. Well, until next time. Bye. Well, that's it for this week's topic. We really appreciate you tuning in. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and check out our foundation website at walkthetalkfoundation.org.
And feel free to reach out and give us feedback. You can get a hold of us via Facebook, X, Instagram, LinkedIn, and our foundation's website. Details in the description section. Thanks for tuning in, and see you next episode.